So while we're getting folks settled in, we've got our first question. Hopefully, we'll get some other folks come along as we go along. But someone has asked what common pitfalls are for the data sufficiencies. So when it pertains to the data sufficiencies in particular, what you have to do is first understand that there's a consistent approach to every data sufficiency, largely based on articulating math into, rather the English into mathematical terms. So were we to take a look at a sample data sufficiency out of the past year's official guide, we can hop on down to, there we go. And we're to take a look at just a sample of, say, number 232 here. And we've got a citrus fruit grower receives $15 for each crate of oranges shipped and $18 for each crate of grapefruit shipped. How many crates of oranges did the grower ship last week? The first thing we need to do is get that out of English and into a more digestible mathematic organization. So you end up with the question there. You can start by just taking down what you know, and in this case we knew that the dollars for oranges, OR, is going to be equal to, I believe it was, $15 each. So 15 each. And then the dollars for GF for grapefruits is going to be equal to $18 each. And then, as we're taking a look, just checking the email, make sure that it's not a wayward attendee. But so if we've got the $15 each for the oranges, $18 each for the grapefruits, we then have to consider what we're being asked for, which is how many crates of oranges did the grower ship last week. So you want to articulate that also mathematically. So that's the question, basically, is the number of oranges is what? And you box that off so you don't lose sight of what you're being asked for. And really, everything should be algebraic. So what we consider now is what we need, and that's what the little n stands for here. So this is your need versus what you know. And the need here is going to be based algebraically off of what has been presented. So we've got two variables, and in theory, we need to have x equations to solve for x variables. So we need two new equations with no new variables. So then if we go back to the sample question, we've got last week the number of oranges that the grower shipped was 20 more than twice the number of crates that the grapefruits that shipped. So we want to articulate that algebraically as opposed to in the English. So we know that we'll have our first condition, and OR is going to be equal to 20 plus 2 times the GF. And so we've got one equation with no new variables, so that helps us, but it doesn't get us a full accounting of what we need, which was the two equations. So then what you like to do is put up your options in terms of your remaining answer choices. And if the first condition is not sufficient, no matter what, you either only have B, C, or E as options. Either condition 2 alone is sufficient, they're sufficient together, or they're neither sufficient together nor alone, which is choice E. So then once we've got condition 1 down and considered, we come to condition 2, which if we go back to the sample question, says that last week the grower received a total of $38,700 from the crates of oranges and grapefruit shipped. So again, we want to articulate that mathematically. So we're going to use those rates that we had earlier to say that 15 O, and we'll just go with O this time around, or we can keep it as OR, plus 18 times the number of grapefruits is going to equal 38,700. Now, by itself, that again only provides one equation of the two that we needed. So that is not sufficient. But then when we combine the two together and consider them equal at the same time, now we have exactly what it is we need. We've got two new equations with no new variables. We do not want to solve. There is absolutely no benefit to solving it to its completion. We know that we could solve, because if we were to say to stack and solve them and create two different equations and set them equal to each other, we could do it. We just don't want to. So that's the methodology behind these data sufficiencies. And really, it's mainly around the idea of focusing on the organization. So if we just wanted to pull out some data sufficiency tips, for example, just here, draw this out a little bit, so we a little bit bigger there. So our data sufficiency tips, whoops, can't spell sufficiency. So first is make sure that you have consistent organization. You'll also need to memorize the choices. So that means that basically, if condition 1 is sufficient, then you have options are either A or D. And if condition 1 is not sufficient, then you're looking at B, C, or E. And you really do want to just memorize that stuff, because that's just going to make your life infinitely better. And you want to articulate and annotate using math. So you will hear a lot of folks talk about things like plugging in and working through data sufficiency that way. But if you can actually articulate and annotate things using the math as opposed to relying on the more kludgy and kind of inexact science of plugging in, it streamlines your approach and makes it so that you know exactly what you're evaluating, as opposed to getting into too many variant possibilities. So I hope that answers what you're asking about the data sufficiencies. Do you have any other follow-up questions about the data sufficiencies while we see if other folks join us? So we did get a follow-up about the data sufficiency. So there is no variance in terms of bias as to which is most common between the A, B, C, D, E options. It's really approximately 20% for each. And the only thing that differs in the process is, pardon me, if you have condition 1 or condition 2 sufficient on their own, you don't actually have to continue to work the process to see whether or not they're sufficient together, which is that extra step. So really, that's probably the fourth thing to add to the sufficiency tips here, is to stop working as soon as you have your clear answer as to the sufficiency. Because it's very easy to end up moving on and continuing further down the line than you really need to on these questions. So with that, I figure that we'll have to go ahead and kind of get into some of the more general things that we were going to talk about. So the first item to talk about, and feel free again to add any questions for follow-up as I work through the agenda here this evening. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was just the format of the exam and the content that you're going to encounter, because it has changed in the last year. So I'll just slide the tips down a little bit here. So the first thing is that you're going to have 4 different sections. So there are 4 sections. 4 sections. And what you're going to have is integrated reasoning, or we'll start with the essay. So the analytical writing, which is going to be 1 essay, and that's in 30 minutes. Whoops. You also will have what is known as the integrated reasoning, and that's 12 questions, also in 30 minutes. Now, these I lovingly refer to as the vestigial tails of the exam, because neither of these items are counted in the 800 score. They are scored independently, and they largely are just a secondary concern. So when it comes to these 2 pieces, generally a 5 or above is sufficient, to steal a term from moments ago, and generally 6 or above is sufficient, unless they, whatever schools you're applying to give you different guidance, that should be sufficient for the average GMAT taker. Now, the 2 pieces that are significantly more relevant for most folks are going to be the verbal reasoning, which is now 36 questions, and now it is in 65 minutes. And you have the quantitative reasoning, which is going to be 31 questions in 62 minutes. Both of those are new scorings for 2018. So they literally changed the exam timing in April with no notice. So they did not give any real warning to this, ended up just changing it on about 2 weeks' notice. Now they are the exams are approximately like 25 minutes shorter than what they had been previously, but that's just something that they were able to do. They also, to talk about the individual setup, so the verbal reasoning, you're looking at a score realistically of between a 6 to a 46, what is known as the raw score scale. And then on the quantitative, you're looking at between a 9 and a 51 raw score scale. And one of the other things that they did most recently, or within the past year with the exams, is that they ended up going with an ordering that can shift. It changes now. So you can now order it where you begin with either the IR and the writing or the verbal and the quant, and you can rearrange the order of it. So the options that you have in terms of the ordering, so you can go with the AWA, which is the essay. You can then go with the IR. Then you go with the quant. And then you go with the verbal. Then your next option is to begin with the verbal. Then you go with the quantitative. And then you go with the integrated reasoning, and then the essay. Or you can go with the quantitative, the verbal, and then again the IR or the essay pair. There is no benefit to going one order versus the other. Truly, it does not matter much at all if, you know, negligible maybe on the placebo effect, right? So there's not a major consideration, but you do want to make sure that you've decided on your order more than anything else to make sure that it's consistent and that on test day you're not changing it. That's probably the only real guidance and recommendation, other than just deciding what you prefer in terms of stamina. Do you prefer having a bit of a lead up that allows you to kind of get into the exam with some level of, you know, practice on the things that matter less in the essay and the integrated reasoning? Or do you like to jump right in because you know that you run out of steam at the end? That's really the only considerations to have in terms of the ordering. You also will have optional 8-minute breaks after every hour, or approximate hour. So what you're looking at is after the AWA and the IR, then you can have an optional 8-minute break. Between the quantitative and the verbal, you can have an optional 8-minute break, and that's the extent of it. Now, when it comes to the actual content, obviously most folks are more familiar with the quantitative and the verbal, and one of the things to be aware of, just roughly from a strategic standpoint, is that the quant scores are significantly higher on average than the verbal scores. It's just the nature of the test takers that take the quantitative exam on the GMAT. So roughly, until you reach 650 plus, the quant score is more important. But because you need to differentiate yourself from your peers to get the 700s and above, the verbal takes more relevancy to your overall 800 score once you get into the 700 plus. So when you're at 700 plus, the verbal score is more important in regards to like how you're going to actually get to that 700 plus that a lot of people tend to aim for on this exam. Are there any questions out there about the overall just structure and format of the exam? All right, well, with that, we'll move on to talking about just kind of preparing for the exam. So one of our attendees asked how much advanced prep time is needed. So standard GMAT curriculum. So to study for this exam, you really do need to set aside time as if you were training for some sort of athletic or other skills-based endeavor. What I usually will compare the GMAT and preparing for it to is preparing for some sort of marathon. It has a lot more in common with that sort of endeavor rather than just preparing or cramming for an individual exam. It's nearly impossible to cram for the GMAT. It's an execution and skills-based exam, not something where you're just memorizing a bunch of facts and then regurgitating them at the end of the semester. So in order to do this, we first need to talk about the content that's on the exam. So you're generally going to require some discussions around arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and word problems on the quantitative side of the exam. So the basics are all present in the main materials that I'm going to recommend here momentarily, but this is not a hard exam because of the content that's provided or that's tested. It's a hard exam because of the timing and the application and needing to be able to identify the best path forward for a problem in a very efficient manner. So you start out with those concepts. Then when you get to the verbal, you're looking at what are known as sentence corrections, critical reasoning, and reading comprehension. And all of these three things are tied to logical predication and understanding just content that's presented to you, and you then have to make decisions, again, in a very brisk pace. So these are the topics that you have to cover. So then you've got to consider, how do you do it? So a standard rigor of a study routine is going to be something like this. Generally, since most GMAT students tend to be folks who have professional careers, you're going to want to do this before you go to work in most cases. What I like to tell students is that your GMAT prep will not affect your workday. Your workday will affect your GMAT prep. So generally, I recommend 60 to 90 minutes of study in the morning. And that's new study, so new practice problems, new content, something, reviewing past notes if you're working with an instructor, that sort of thing. Then you want to go to work or rest, depending on if you're doing this on, say, a summer break, because I've got some students doing that right now, you may rest for a while. And this needs to be a minimum of 2 to 4 hours, because you have to have a gap time in order to review whatever it is that you've covered that day. So then you're looking at generally 60 to 90 minutes of study review in the afternoon or evening. And what that means is that when you do practice problems, it's not good enough just to do it, look at it, and say, I got it right, I'm done. Or do it, look at it, go to the back of the book and say, well, I got it right, or I got it wrong, and I understand their explanation. Instead, you have to consider that were there alternative ways to have gotten to the correct answer, understand on the verbal side why some of the incorrect answers are in fact incorrect, so that you're taking away the seeming subjectivity of the exam. So then we talk about, how do you actually get into prepping on your own? So the first thing that you're going to probably want in order to start facilitating this routine, so if we're talking about the GMAT recommended materials, the first is going to be the official guide to the GMAT. Now, where I just pulled our sample problem from was from the 2018 version of this delightful book. Every year, the GMAT comes out with a new version. The 2019 version just came out last week. So since I'm sharing my screen, I can't show you my copies that just came in the mail. But it's pretty much the same thing as 2018, 2017, 2016, going all the way back. They change about maybe a tenth of the questions every year. The big ticket item this year is that they actually have a much improved sentence correction section, which is actually worthwhile to kind of mention here briefly, because for the longest time, they just gave you an incredibly arbitrary compendium of basic English grammar rules, which is not helpful at all. And you can take that from somebody who's got a journalism degree from Northwestern University here in Chicago, but it's incredibly arbitrary and random. So I would usually tell my students to basically ignore it. Now they've actually got into the fact that it's more about meaning and less about grammar when it comes to the sentence corrections. So that's a net benefit. So that's just the one major thing that's changed, but that's going to be your primary source of material every time. So the official guide to the GMAT has approximately, they it's about 900 problems when you include the integrated reasoning, but about 800 quantitative and verbal problems in total. And if you need additional resources, they also have the official quantitative workbook and the official verbal workbook. And both of these are going to include an additional, what do they got this year? I think it's somewhere around 300 for each. And it looks like, yep, 300 questions on the quant, and I believe it's 300 for the verbal, but there's something very similar, 301. So yeah, approximately 300 questions each, more, and so approximately 300 verbal problems, and you've got approximately 300 quant problems, I think exactly 300 quant problems. So all told, from these materials, you get 1,600 questions, or sorry, 1,400 questions that you can use to really improve your knowledge of the exam straight from the exam makers, which is always preferable to going to a third-party mechanism, because this is exactly what the exam tests and how it tests it. These are older problems that they used to use, so they are exactly what you'd expect to see. The next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the practice exam. So there's no two ways about it. You're going to want to do some practice exam work. So if I go here and create a new tab here, there we go. So if we go to MBA.com, we can go to the official starter practice kit online. You can see that it's free. The first two practice exams are free from the GMAT people. And I've got a delightful pop-up. They are also the only website in the world that still uses pop-ups, but you can see that they've got two free practice exams. This is definitely the spot to start in terms of practice materials. So we go into their GMAT preparation tab here. You'll also see that they've got additional practice exams that are available, exams 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those are going to be the gold standard, and really for the amount of practice work that you're going to put in, they should be sufficient. I generally will recommend somewhere, if we're talking about the study routine, I guess I can add this in here as well, you want to budget 8 to 12 weeks minimum. And I'd say that generally 4 months is enough, so 8 to 12 weeks minimum for prep, but I'd say that there's probably a max of 16 weeks. Beyond that, unless you have specific needs that, your math is significantly remedial just because you haven't done it in a long time, or maybe your English is a second language, that may be another concern. So there's definitely some need to make sure that you've got the right amount of time, but you probably don't need to be doing, a practice exam once a week for the next 6 months. That probably is going to end up being a bit of overkill. So the official GMAT prep online exams are going to be another place for recommended materials. And the last thing that I like to show off is a really antiquated website that is there for calculation drills, because one of the biggest challenges for most students is the sheer fact that the GMAT does not include a calculator. So everybody has to do the math in their head, or on their paper more accurately. But in order to improve those skills, I, again, compare it to set yourself up to where you're, doing a athletic endeavor and you just had to run the hill when you were a kid. This is your running the hill for the GMAT. There's no way around it. You're going to need to be able to do some multiplication. So you may go into a multiplication fact sheet here on math, math aids. And you can scroll down and you see there's the times tables. General rule of thumb is to have at least up to 25 by 25 as something that you can do comfortably. And then we can take a look at the multiple digit multiplication worksheets over here. So you can click on however many digits you want. Again, 2 by 2 is probably a good one. And then you go ahead and create problems. You scroll down to the bottom, and you can hit this big ugly blue button that says Create It. And that gets you where you need to go on the old math aids. So with that, that's pretty much the majority of the overall content for getting prepped out that I wanted to get to. So are there any immediate GMAT questions about any of the things that I've talked about in terms of the recommended materials, the study routine, the curriculum you can expect, the content of the exam, before I turn it over to Michelle, who's going to talk a bit about how the GMAT plays into the admissions process? All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Michelle at Aringo, who is the CEO of the Americas over there, and will give you a better idea from just a holistic perspective. We got a quick question first, actually. Hold on just a second, Michelle. So got a question about getting the scores back after the exam. It's actually immediate. So they will give you a what is called a preview score as soon as you're done, and you can either accept it or not accept it. And then you have to wait for your official scores for about 2 weeks, wherein they basically go through and make sure that there weren't any sort of anomalies in the exam. I've never heard of anything beyond 10 points, and even that is extremely rare. It's mainly to make sure they've got time to grade your essay, because that still has to be manually graded. But then you basically get the scores instantaneously. So now I am happy to turn it over to my colleague Michelle. So Michelle, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and good evening. I hope you all can hear me. In fact, Stefan, I can still see you. Could you give me a nod if you can hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's see here. So first of all, apologies. I just realized that I need to remind myself on how to share. Oh, Stephanie did it for me, I think. Thank you so much. So sharing my screen here. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up so that all you see is my beautiful screen here. And as Stefan was explaining a moment ago, I'm here to fill in kind of the rest of the process very quickly, though. We're on limited time, so I won't be going into too much detail this evening. However, I want to encourage you, all of you, including anyone who might listen to this later, to feel free to reach out to me, for either a more personalized response to questions surrounding this area, or if you would just like a little bit more detail, I'm always happy to be a resource to you. So now that Stefan has talked about these important initial steps in prepping for the GMAT, and of course, earning a competitive score for the schools you're applying to, this is where we step in, is with the application itself. And so even if you don't wind up working with an expert like those of us at Aringo, I want you to know that if nothing else, these are 7 things that you need to not just know, but ace in order to make it through the admissions process. So the first step is your resume. And you already know that you're going to need to send them one. However, a common misconception that I find when I meet MBA candidates is that they think the resume is going to be more of a formality, similar to applying to some jobs out there. And the truth is, the admissions committees pay a lot of attention to your resume. It's one of the first documents that they'll look at when they open your admissions packet. And so it's important that you do have it clear, concise, and highlighting the right areas. You really want to make sure that your resume doesn't just go into detail about your company or what your job title is, but instead that you immediately highlight impressive accomplishments, responsibilities, highlight awards. Do go ahead and include a company description if it's not readily obvious. The rule of thumb is just ask yourself if you think the admissions committee has heard of your company. If you are not sure if it's anything other than absolutely, then go ahead and do a brief company description. This is especially important for international applicants. You may be coming from companies that the admissions committees might not be readily familiar with. So feel free to fill in something brief after the title of the company, like Spain's largest media conglomerate, or Italy's equivalent to the US Special Service. I'm giving you real examples that I've seen. But whatever you do, make sure not to only state your positions, your job positions, and do show the connection between your experience to the future goals that you describe later on in your application. Now, I just said the magic G word, goals. How do you find your goals? I know from working in this industry for a few years now that this isn't always crystal clear. Oftentimes candidates have an idea of what they'd like to do, but they don't know exactly what it is, or they're hoping that going to business school will help them decide on the next step. That's fine. I want you to know this first and foremost, that you're normal, so take a deep breath. Don't worry about it. But now that I've told you to relax a bit, I'm going to tighten you back up by telling you that, however, in your applications, did not mean to turn that off. Sorry, everybody. Let me open that back up. Okay. In your application, you do want to be able to show that you know exactly what you are intending on doing. So part of this is going to be beginning. I like to think of this as a funnel. Start at the top, dream big, literally think of what your dream career would be, then begin to narrow that down into other directions that you could possibly go. Once you've done even that first step of just funneling out some other areas you'd like to work in, you can begin to show the connection to your history. And by history, I mean your work experience, extracurricular activities, academic classes you've taken, anything you can think of that relates to any of these future goals. That's a connection. We like to call that the dotted line. This is where you need to make a case for why the MBA is going to help you get to that next step. And by the way, this is a added hint here that I'm adding, is that you want to make sure that you're also demonstrating how that program, so in other words, not just any MBA, but why the HBS MBA or the Kellogg MBA, Stefan, that was for you, needs to be attained in order to get to your next step. Networking. So this is a real concern I hear from people, especially if you're coming from an industry or a family or anything where there aren't a lot of MBAs around you. It can be kind of scary to think about the connections you need to make. So number one, LinkedIn. We highly recommend LinkedIn, but let me stop you right there. Please don't jump on LinkedIn and just start sending connection requests to all these poor MBAs and MBA students. Be a little bit more focused. What I recommend is take a look at student clubs and organizations at the different schools that you're interested in attending. Oftentimes, those organizations will have LinkedIn pages, and within those organizations have student ambassadors that are glad to talk to potential students like yourself. Reach out to those clubs and organizations. It'll give you a better idea of the culture on campus. You'll have a friendly face and name. Again, rather than just blindly shooting out messages to a bunch of people, you have to keep in mind that anybody affiliated, especially with a top 10 MBA program, students, faculty, staff, they get hit up all the time. So you want it to be a focused effort. Also, go to MBA fairs, attend info sessions that the schools go to. It's not that you're looking for the magic person or to learn the secret handshake. It's about learning the culture of the program, so that when you apply, you can show that you've done your research and that you're not just applying to the name brand, but that you actually know the program and why it's a good fit for you. And then last, and I say last because it's the most important, last but not least, right? Visit campuses, please. I know there's a lot of debate out there about whether or not it's worth it. And that goes back to people thinking maybe it's not because you're not going to meet this magic person. That's not what campus visits are about. Campus visits are about knowing as much as possible about the program. And there's certain things you're never going to pick up on about culture and fit from the internet. You need to set foot on campus and mingle with the stakeholders. So approaching your essays. This is probably the most important part of your application aside from your GMAT. The essays are where you have an opportunity to distinguish yourself. Even with an excellent GMAT score and resume, here's how you're going to distinguish yourself from other candidates with excellent resumes and GMAT scores. So strategize before you begin. Make sure you actually answer the questions. I would like to underline that for you right now, but I'm not as quick as Stefan with the online tools here. Make sure that you do not take these as blank spaces to write whatever you like. The admissions committees work hard and think quite critically over the questions and prompts that they ask you, so please do answer the question. Make sure you're always connecting it to your goals and why the degree is needed. And do stay modest and mature. Skipping to the end, I love the Haas value, confidence with humility. Yes, you need to tell them what makes you a great candidate. No, you don't want to be a jerk. It's my very professional advice this evening. And then finally, be careful when recycling essays. I'd love to draw a line through that and just tell you, don't recycle essays. Of course, you are the same candidate at every school you're applying to. That should not change, but you do need to make sure that your essays are carefully written to appeal to the values and traits that each individual school is looking for. So there really shouldn't be a lot of recycling happening. Recommendations. My mom thinks I'm great. Can I use her? We always get a laugh at that. However, chances are, if you're listening to this, you may be one of the people who legitimately will be using your mother or your uncle or your sister as a recommendation. For example, if you work for a family company, that is just fine. But needless to say, we want those letters to be as objective as possible. If you need tips on how to do that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Most schools are going to ask you for 2 recommenders. Do choose these people carefully. Whenever possible, it's best that these be workplace recommendations, preferably your boss or even higher up is good. But what's most important is that they're going to be able to speak specifically about you, your traits, and give real examples of what makes you a stellar candidate. This means that sometimes the CEO or the CFO or the CTO might not be the right person for you if they don't actually know you that well. So stick to the person who can give real quality examples. You do not need to use academic references. There are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, if you're applying to a regular 2-year or 1-year full-time MBA program, you really should stick to workplace examples, unless you're applying to a deferred admissions program like the 2+2 at HBS, which will require an academic reference, or if you are in the rare scenario of having worked for a professor, say in like a lab setting or a research setting. But most of the time for business schools, they would rather see a workplace example. Now, extracurricular activities. I need to drop a bomb on you right now. If you are applying this year, meaning in the next couple of months, and you do not already have extracurriculars on your resume, it's too late. Please don't go out and join 5 clubs now or go volunteer for several different activities now. Actually, let me amend that. Please do if you're passionate about it and you want to do it, which is what you should do anyways. But don't think about it from a business school perspective. What they're most interested in is that you have been giving back passionately for long periods of time on a consistent basis. So anything you add to your profile at this point, it's likely just going to look like you only did it for the sake of business school. That's definitely not what they want. But if you're applying a few years from now, or if you already have been volunteering or working on an activity outside of work, I highly encourage that you mention these in your application. It paints you as a broader person. It demonstrates an interest in giving back to the community, which is a highly valued trait at several top 10 schools. And it also demonstrates that you're giving back to your community in a way that you uniquely can as an educated professional person. Last but not least, please do think about your online presence. As we say at the top here, Google yourself, your interviewer will. That, frankly, is a scary thought if you haven't thought about it sooner. Of course, your LinkedIn should be up to date. It really should match your resume. It should have examples and projects and hopefully even recommendations from peers and bosses that you've worked with in the past, along with your extracurricular activities. But I also like to take a moment to tell you to make sure that the rest of your social media is cleaned up too. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that anybody out there has anything, scandalous or whatever on their Facebook. But we all have that, I'll say Uncle Bob or that friend from high school that likes to, post the ridiculous and the shocking materials. You don't want that coming up when the interviewer from HBS Googles your name. So take a moment to clean up your social media and ask yourself, would I want Harvard to see this? Would I want Stanford to see this? Would I want Kellogg to see this joke that my old Uncle Bob posted? So do think about online presence and make sure that it supports the narrative that you're sharing with them. So forgive me, that was a very quick overview of the 7 things that you need to know to apply to business school successfully. I'd love to give you more detail, or more importantly, specific details personalized for yourself. So don't hesitate to either reach out to me directly. There's my email address, michelleM@aringo.com, or if you're not ready to talk to me yet, but you'd like to check out the services we have to offer, we have lots of free tools on our website, like a complimentary chances calculator that can give you the probability of being admitted to a range of schools, along with a lot of free essay tips and interview materials on aringo.com. So check out our site, lots of free stuff. And then if after looking it over, if you'd like to get a complimentary consultation where we can answer some of your specific questions, there is a link there to register for a complimentary call, which if you live in North or South America, that will be with me. All right. That was a lot of material in a short period of time. I hope you're all still with me, but thanks for listening tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and close out of this to see if anyone has written a question. Okay, I don't see any questions. Do you, Stefan?
I do not. So I think we're good. So I'm just going to so first I'll thank Michelle for giving us all of that great background. And I'm basically going to bid you with the same kind of thing. If there are any other GMAT questions, whether it's specific, general, you can email me at smainier@myguruedge.com. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the exam, whether it's specific to individual questions even, or particular strengths, weaknesses. We've been doing this a long time, so we really do know a lot of the different ways to improve, and know that there's no one right way for any student. So anyhow, we'd really like to thank you for joining us this evening, and hope that you have a wonderful 4th of July.